Greetings to everyone. I wish a very happy and prosperous 2021 to all of you. Today we will be starting a lecture on negotiating spaces within religion. This would be covered in two parts. In this lecture, we would be exploring the contrasting images which cut through the frozen iconization of women encountered in the classical or the so-called high tradition texts. The various myths in the process of their transmissions and transmutations as well as metamorphosis do not follow a straight line. Rather, there is a zigzag way, a meandering way which they generally follow, a point that has been made by the great scholar Vijaya Ramaswamy. So, as we dwell upon the various myths, we would also highlight as to how most of these myths are a result of several patriarchal traditions. Most of the myths have been the result of male script writers and their strong negative portrayals that created a different kind of a problematic for the entire domain of women-oriented myths. So, reforming the myths was a very important part of the entire patriarchal agenda. The various narrators of different ballads, myths, folk tales, etc. were invariably male and were often even the performers of these several ballads and dramas until the 19th century, when women began appearing on stage, subtly changing the mode of representation and subtly changing the mode of communication. And it was in this background that one can now discuss the entire concept of goddess worship and how that has evolved over a period of time. Several forms as well as functions that are ascribed to the worship of goddesses have evolved from very earliest part of Indian history, that is from Vedic to the classical era. Goddesses were imagined in different ways as nurturers, protectors, purifiers, life givers, mothers within religion, yet some were imagined in negative light also as highly malicious, fierce, aggressive, or even malevolent. So, it was not as if the goddesses could be perceived or could be understood from one particular standpoint. If we talk about Vedic goddesses in their several benevolent forms, we can talk about the goddess like Usha, the goddess of dawn, then Prithvi related to earth, Aditi, mother of gods or kings, then Saraswati, river, and Vak, that is the goddess of speech, Shri, the goddess of glory, prosperity, and several malevolent forms also like Nirti and Ratri, that is related to the concept of darkness associated with gloom and several obstacles. And all these goddesses were worshipped during various spans of history. Now, these goddesses became the models of the social engagement and relations for women in the contemporary society. And the most powerful female figure that emerged during the post-Vedic pantheon was that of Durga. Now, coming to the several forms of Durga, while in eastern India, Durga or Mahishasur-Mardini has been depicted in the forms of Gauri, Parvati, Uma and Lalita, Durga got transformed into the mother of two children, Ganesha and Kartikeya, lately. As has been pointed out by scholars like Meeta Deka, the change in the representations of the goddesses definitely corresponds to the change in the gender relations that appeared in the social structure as time went on. So, the reality that soon emerged was that how the goddess tradition came to be ascribed to the domestic domain. So, several depictions reflect the aspect of domesticity, a loving and nurturing mother, and most goddesses came to be worshipped in this form. So, the two major cults that emerged out of this belief system were the Shaivism and Shaktism. Now, coming to the concept of Shakti and Shakta cult, various later Vedic texts, for example, Mahabharata, Markandeya Puran, Kalika Puran and Yogini Tantra, etc., are considered to be authoritative texts which also kind of symbolized or explained the origin and the genesis of female power. The female power that was embodied in the concept of fertility as well as motherhood. So, women's life form or the depiction came to be perceived as one who was giving life, one who was a life giver, as well as one with destructive powers, which is and a woman assumed that destructive power to eradicate evil which coexisted in the same persona. So, with this kind of depiction, both the opposite poles began to appear. That is, on the one hand the concept of love and the other hand the concept of fear. This reflects the devotee's simultaneous attachment to the aspect of love and fear towards the object of worship. So, the practice of male dominance was instituted by suppressing the female power through the several social institutions like caste and family. Now, a question that arises here is that does a portrayal of a woman in the form of a goddess or deity worship, does it really bring about egalitarianism? As has been pointed out by David Kinsley, no clear relationship exists between the goddess centered worship or religion and an egalitarian society, and this is very true as far as Indian society is concerned. Women's role in religious rituals got eroded from being equal partners to their husband during the early Vedic period to that of mere domestic beings from later Vedic period onwards, and this transformation has been dealt with in greater detail in some of the earlier lectures. So, the concept of purity and pollution both became hand in glove, and a systematic exclusion from several ritualistic religious processes, duties, rites was an expression of inherent impurity of a female body. However, women remained central to the home-based worship, and that also explains why they occupied central place as far as the deity worship was concerned. So, it is in this context that one can talk about the important role played by the pujas and several vratas. The daily puja as well as special pujas on specific days remained the preserve of female religious process, and the several vratas or religious rites came to be exclusively prescribed for women, and they also came to occupy a central experience and a very important experience as far as the feminine form was concerned. So, the vratas were undertaken as vows practiced by women all over India, each region having its own popular vratas and reasons also being ascribed to those. So, as has been pointed out by several scholars, in course of time these vratas also indicated some kind of male empowerment, because most of these vratas or fasts were undertaken to ensure specific gains, well-being, longevity of the husband or the other male members of the family. and and some of the vratas were also specific for securing an ideal husband. So most vratas revolved around family, and they also involved the prioritization of males, hence empowering further their existence and the entire patriarchal structure. Now, it is from this standpoint that one can delve deeper in this subject. A very interesting study has been undertaken by A.K. Ramanujan in several of his essays, and he has made a very important point about the connection between women as the bearers and carriers of tales and women's agency in giving specific shape and form to these several tales in the entire course of their narration. So, one can definitely look at several myths from a feminist gaze. And this is what has been attempted by Vijaya Ramaswamy, who has undertaken a very detailed kind of a study about several Tamil myths, Tamil heroines, goddesses from this standpoint. A feminist gaze can critically view various categories within which women have been imagined, and also how these categories kept on changing over a period of time. So, the point that she makes again and again is the zigzag route which these various tales took instead of a linear route. The several Tamil myths do not follow a very simplistic kind of an explanation. Rather, they have to be understood within the indigenous Tamil tradition, which predated Brahmanical culture, and how these myths gradually got absorbed into the Brahmanic patriarchal stereotyping of women as silent, chaste, and self-sacrificing. So, it's a very interesting kind of a study which brings to light this kind of change that came about over a period of time in the depiction and in the understanding and in the communication of these various tales, fables, stories, legends, etc. So, one can talk about Karpu as godliness in Tamil society. Karpu basically meant divinity like chastity. So, the stereotyping of women in Tamil society has largely revolved around the notion of Karpu. So, Karpu basically meant the sacred power of the woman, and the power of Karpu was to be both feared as well as respected, because it could be boons giving as well as it could bring about great destruction if that Karpu was threatened or challenged. So, it was in this background that the concept of wife goddess became very important. The virtue of Karpu imbibed the wife with great spiritual powers and also changed her into a Patini Daivam, literally meaning a wife goddess. And this concept of wife goddess was very important and peculiar as an institution in Tamil society. The same notion of Karpu was also found in the didactic Jain text Tirukural, which belonged to the late Sangam era. The operative force behind the worship and reverence of the Patini Daivam was the fear of her power of chastity. So, by indulging in such narratives and by making a woman as a divine power who had to imbibe some kind of purity in her character, the same patriarchal norm was being reinstated. And another important term that emerged was Ananku, which meant female sexual power. In several Dravidian cultures, the spiritual power of a woman was linked to both the fear of pollution through menstruation as well as the male fear of female sexuality, because it was very pure. It was supposedly to be pure. So the ancient Tamils defined female sexual power as Ananku, which was a force to be simultaneously feared as well as revered. Ananku within and outside marriage also came to be defined separately. A woman's Ananku, if it was within the paradigm of marriage and if it was being expressed by a chaste wife, could be pure, could be auspicious, could be lucky, and so she came to be described as a Sumangali. Whereas if it was outside the marital framework, then the Ananku of the woman was a deadly and a destructive power which had to be repelled at all costs. Now, Vijaya Ramaswamy has described this entire epic tradition and the Sangam texts with reference to Karpu as well as Ananku. And the great Tamil late Sangam epic Sila Padikaram associated Ananku with female power, and the two concepts got reflected clearly in the character of Kannagi, who was the heroine of Sila Padikaram. Kannagi, who was hailed in texts as a Karpu Kurasi, literally meaning the queen of chastity, that is the symbol of purity, became an example from the Tamil epic tradition of the power of purity as well as female spirituality. So Kannagi soon came to be revered as the goddess because of these very qualities. She was defined in Tamil society as a goddess Kannagi, and in the texts operating between Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, the representation of Kannagi changed from a wife who was full of anger and who wanted to take revenge to a deadly cobra. So here again we see that there was different kind of portrayal and metamorphosis that was constantly taking place in the depiction of female goddesses. Next we can also talk about another example, that was Nala Tangal, who was a widow with many children, who was left destitute by her husband and she was ill treated at her in-laws' place. As a result, Nala Tangal killed herself and also her helpless children by jumping or throwing them into the well. So, this was the story, and from this story emerged the concept of the tragic widow. And this tragic widow, her presence in the Tamil folk landscape was driven by a cruel patriarchal society into killing herself as well as her innocent children. As has been pointed out by Margaret Travick, these kind of stories also indicate social tensions that existed in Tamil society and especially in several relations that existed in Tamil society. So, the image of a wicked sister-in-law or a not too ideal a husband who kind of forced Nala Tangal to take this extreme step placed the wife at the periphery. Now, a very interesting description has been undertaken in the writing on cunning wives and sorceresses, queens, the ballads of Neeli and Aravalli Suravalli. These are two balladic traditions that have been studied by Vijaya Ramaswamy, which have female villains taking center stage. So, on the one hand, there is Neeli. On the other hand, there are two murderous queens, Aravalli and Suravalli, and through these ballads, Vijaya Ramaswamy has tried to explain how different portrayals of women were being undertaken in Tamil society. Here also we see that the legend of Neeli meanders between two bipolarities. The two bipolarities are, on the one hand, Neeli is described as the dreaded demoness and on the other hand she is described as the goddess Issaki Amma, who was the protector of the village. So the split images of Neeli as a demoness as well as a goddess was increasingly being explained in several Shaivite hagiographical texts, specifically Karaikal Pair, or a 12th century text. The Veer Shaivite Neeli went through a range of different imaging, from a prostitute to a pure Jaina nun to the saintly Shaivite Nayanar pair. So these different portrayals indicate the kind of spatial transformation which this specific ballad was taking. The story of Neeli is as widely varied in historical time and space as it is changing its character as it moved from Tamil Nadu to Karnataka. And the theme of Neelakesi was the folk story of Palayanur Neeli. So Neeli came to be projected at one point of time as a pure wife, as has been explained in the 12th century text Periya Puranam, which described Neeli as the wife of a Brahman who fell into the trap of a prostitute and killed his pregnant wife, robbing her of all her possessions and jewelry. So it was this incident that made Neeli as a vengeful ghost, and in the next birth the Brahman reappeared as a merchant, and he came to Palayanur in search of trade prospects, but Neeli, who had turned into a vengeful ghost, pursued him, and she claimed to be his wife, and she appealed to the Vellalar agricultural community of wealthy merchants to restore her conjugal rights. So as the story goes, Neeli became deceitful, and this deceitful Neeli shed false tears to impress the village elders, and as a result everyone believed in her story. And even today in Tamil culture, if any woman is shedding hypocritical tears or is posing to be sad, a phrase that is used is stop shedding Neeli Kaneer, that is stop shedding false tears. So here now Neeli emerged as a murderer, another different portrayal of Neeli. So despite the protests of the Brahmin that he did not know her, the Vellalar community trusted her story and forced them to stay together, and in the night Neeli very conveniently murdered him, and she ultimately took the revenge. It is said that the 70 Vellalar elders of the village who had passed this judgment also committed mass suicide in remorse, and hence the evidence of several memorial stones which exists in some of these regions in Tiruvilangadu and also some of the hero stones, memorial stones which belong to Neeli at the same site around Vellalar proves the some kind of existence of the story, and how Neeli ultimately converted into the dreaded Kali. After murdering her husband, Neeli continued to live in Tiruvalangadu, and soon this legend got linked with the legend of Kali. She became the dreaded Kali of this region and started controlling the border between Palayanur and Tiruvalangadu. So as a result, a woman who once herself had been wronged was described as the destructive Neeli, and the entire area was described as seething with some kind of protest against whatever was happening to them. And she, along with a fearsome army, started indulging in devastation, and the entire area came under the grip of her wrath. Even the gods found her activities intolerable, and they appealed to Lord Vishnu for help. And ultimately, it was the male principle that came to triumph, and this has been described as the form of Shiva Shakti dance. So, instead of waging an open war against the destructive Kali, Shiva decided to challenge her to a dancing contest. And following the famous mythology of the Shiva Shakti dance, which is narrated in several Shaivite sacred texts like Chidambaram, Kali mashed him step for step till he took recourse to the Chanda stance, in which the legs had to be raised up. Now, once this step was undertaken, as a woman, Kali decided not to perform this out of modesty and therefore lost this contest. The dancing Nataraja hence reigned supreme, while Kali abides at the borders as a subordinate ally Devtai. So, again we see that there was some kind of a metamorphosis in this entire process of deification of Neeli, and several popular versions of this myth conclude with the deification of Neeli as well as her enshrinement as Isaki Amma in Tiruvallneli and Kanyakumari districts, as well as Tiruvalangadu, which was the original region from where this folk tale had started. Now, the deification of several deviant, dangerous, murderous women who constituted the socially marginalized or ostracized subaltern women was a very common phenomenon in ancient Indian or early medieval culture, and this definitely fits into that kind of a narrative. Thank you.